Hey guys, it's Gary. Back very soon. Cheers. I'm showing how low class I can truly be by drinking beer. Something I've been doing a lot of it lately. Much more so than I used to. But I'm going to improve this video by 50% over my past videos. Please excuse my appearance, by the way. The 50% improvement is I'm not going to bitch about work right now. The reason I'm here, got home from work about, I don't know, an hour and a half or so ago. Took a shower, cooked a frozen pizza, and now I'm here. Reason being is Karn just put up a video, his second, and the coincidences, serendipity as he calls them, between us keeps happening. In the background, within 3 seconds, I recognized the record he was playing in the background, and it was Special Efx, Mystique, Hands of the Healer is the name of the piece. One of my favorite pieces ever of the band, and that's my favorite album. And I actually have had it on my list to pick up a copy of it to send to Karn because I didn't think he would ever buy Special Efx for himself, the band. They're kind of a smooth jazz band. For some reason, I got an obsession with them in the early 90s after buying one of their recordings. And I don't really know why. Excuse me. They're very good smooth jazz band at a time that smooth jazz wasn't the formula that it became, that basically ruined it. To me, when smooth jazz became nothing but basically R&B instrumental stuff, it was over, and it faded really from popularity at that point too. There was a time when they started, well, I mean, they started before the smooth jazz years, so they kind of were a band that by the time I got into them, they were, 6 or 7 years into their career. And it was basically a band of Chieli Minucci, who's a guitarist, still around and still doing albums under the name Special Efx, and George Jinda, a hand percussionist from Hungary, who had settled in New York, and hooked up, I think, through a series of jam sessions with Chieli Minucci. And Minucci's my age, but George Jinda was probably 20 years older than him. A bit of an age gap, but they got together through some jam sessions in New York City. And in the area that I live in, being right outside New York City, they played gigs a lot during times when they probably weren't touring, simply because they could book a local gig and drive home after the gig, so it wasn't the big expense of renting hotel rooms and that kind of thing. So I probably got to see them, or let's put it this way, they played around, and Chieli Minucci still does, probably a lot more than other people in other parts of the country that are into them would ever get to see them. I got such a stack of CDs here. I don't know why I became so obsessed with them. They both lived in New York City, not too far away from me. I like the idea of they weren't really a two-man band. It was two guys in the band that led it, with tons and tons of additional musicians. Now, just because I have so many CDs here related, I'm going to have to keep turning my back to grab things. I'm going to go semi in order. This isn't a very good album. Their first album, they was released over, I want to say the Netherlands. Somebody signed them to an ultra obscure contract in the Netherlands, and even though they were a New York band, they couldn't get arrested here initially. But after that album came out, the first album in the Netherlands, GRP Records, which was in its early years, early 80s, picked up their first album for distribution, just called Special Efx. Now the weird thing is, it was never really explained why there's basically 6 or 7 musicians that play on it, and as you see, 6 of them are pictured here, and yet every piece of history I ever read in the band always said it was just Chieli Minucci on guitars, George Jinda on hand percussion, and all the other guys were just guests that came and went. I get the feeling that when they recorded their first album, it may have actually been a more formal band. They had 2 keyboard players, playing a lot of synthesizers, And both of them actually appeared on the group's first 5 albums or so, not exclusively, not on every track kind of thing. But they played the first 5 or 6 albums. The two keyboard players would show up here and there on different tracks. I tend to think maybe at the time that they recorded the first album, it was kind of a band, and the other guys didn't commit or had dropped out pretty much by the time the second album came. I was never real clear on that. Never clear on why there's 6 people listed here, when every little piece of history I read always claimed it was Chieli Minucci and George Jinda and whoever they chose to invite for that album. Not a very good album, very formative thing, not particularly well recorded, more something for completists. But by the time they came to their second album, you know, I put little notes in these for myself, and then I cover up the cover image so that you can't see the cover. By the time in like '85, they came with Modern Manners, and you could see in the back it was then just the two of them. That's George with the mustache and Chieli Minucci. You can see, I don't know if you can tell, quite an age difference between the two of them. They had formulated more of a sound. And you really think this was still the early days. Smooth jazz as a term wasn't even around. So it was jazzy, it was mellow, wasn't funky at all. Interesting thing, that's a GRP. Dave Grusin actually plays on here as a guest. Mark Egan from the Pat Metheny group, who played a bunch on their early albums. And there's a guest appearance, a piano solo by none other than McCoy Tyner, which is probably their closest association with real mainstream jazz, having McCoy Tyner. He only plays a piano solo on one track, but it's an extended solo. And with the second album, they started a trend that interested me a great deal. Maybe one of the reasons why I stuck with them is every album they had one track that was just Chieli Minucci on guitars, sometimes little keyboards in the background, and George Jinda on hand percussion. Just the two of them they would do a duet track. That'd be overdubbing, so technically maybe not a duet, but pretty much just guitars and percussion. And a lot of times it was just an improvised thing. But they did one on every single album that the two of these guys stayed together for. And that was always the first track I would listen to when I would get a new album by them, or pick up an album I didn't previously have. I want to hear what the duet sounds like. So, you know, this is a pretty good album. It's got a couple really standout pieces, a nice jazzy album, not a formula-bound smooth jazz album at all. Third album, even better, Slice of Life. There's some oddball covers with Watermelon. This to me, a lot of bright synthesizers on here, up-tempo music. Again, there's another duet for George Jinda on percussion, Chieli Minucci on guitars. Guests once again include Mark Egan, Dave Weckl on drums, Dennis Chamber on drums. There's some acoustic guitars on here also. Some really nice up-tempo pieces, bright synthesizer colors. This album to me always sounds like a Saturday morning album, the kind of thing you'd put on, peppy, up, bright. None of their albums have anything difficult. They never got into any kind of avant-gardism, which is surprising. Sometimes I think I just decided to focus on a band, good or bad, and just stuck with them and bought everything that I could. And for some reason, I really honed in on these guys. Their next album, which would be their fourth album, is my favorite album by them. And the only sad thing is I've listened to it so much, I hate to say I'm like sick of it, but it's fantastic. Definitely the most new age, the most evocative. I don't know, I could probably... They did later on a few mellow albums, but their mellow albums were different. They were more acoustic, guitar-oriented, whereas this is, I'll say new age, but there's a lot of synthesizer textures. A bunch of really good. There's a track on here called Rainy Sunday that sounds just like what it sounds like, the title. And all of their albums were split between guitarist Chieli Minucci's compositions. He would write about half the album. And George Jinda would write the other half with his musical writing partner, Sashi, who I'll bring up later, a piano player. George Jinda was originally from Hungary, and so was Sashi. And I think they must have gotten together before George Jinda moved to America, before George moved to New York. And almost every single thing that George Jinda recorded, almost everything, had a co-composer credit to Sashi, even when Sashi didn't play on the albums. Sashi shows up on a few of the Special Efx albums as a guest keyboard player, but doesn't play on most of them. And yet I can only think of one composition that was not co-credited that George Jinda ever did, that was not co-credited to Sashi, his writing partner. So Sashi being in Hungary still, I don't know if he ever moved to America. I don't exactly know what the writing process was between the two of them with George Jinda. But I only know of one George Jinda track that was written totally on his own. So you have the colors of the Chieli Minucci compositions and the George Jinda and Sashi compositions, which was nice. You can't, oddly enough, you can't, almost never can you just sit there and listen to them and say, oh, that one was written by Manucci, that one was written by George Jinda and Sashi. For whatever reason, their styles are all over the place. You know, they can do up-tempo things, low-key things, acoustic-oriented things, whatever. And you can't really ever pick out who did what until you read the credits. I hope this video is going to work because I have almost no space left on my computer. But I was so into Special Efx for a good 10 years or so. I bought anything and everything that they were on. I even bought this, GRP Christmas Collection, because they did one track, or I should say Chieli Minucci and George Jinda did the spaciest version you'll ever hear of Silent Night. Just the two of them, apparently. You can hear the hand percussion of George Jinda and the guitars, and actually it's all pretty much guitars, very keyboard sounding guitars though, probably using a guitar synthesizer. And if I didn't tell you it was Silent Night, you might not pick up on it was Silent Night, but I bought this just for that one track. Interestingly, a duet between the two of them, done in a very spacey way. Like I said, I bought anything and everything these guys did, including side projects. Here's one of the worst. Well, I should. I think I arranged these in the order that they came out in initially. So I'm showing things. I'm jumping back and forth between group and solo projects. But apparently, during some off time in 1988, this was now I only found out about. God knows how. Called Missing Links. That's the name of the band. It wasn't really a band. It was just a bunch of musicians from the New York area thrown together that during their off time in 1988 made this concept album. I don't think they toured. And I bought it because George Jinda plays on it. But it's got Robbie Condor, who was one of those early, really good synthesizer players that played on the early Special Efx albums. It's got Dennis Chamber on drums, Victor Bailey on bass, Najee on saxophones. Oh, man. Omar Hakim plays drums on this. Bernie Wright, Najee, I mentioned already. Victor Bailey, did I say Victor Bailey? I think I did. Lenny Pickett. Nile Rodgers. Lot of named people. Lenny Pickett. The concept of this Missing Links, this is an album that came and went out of print really quick, and I found the copy. It was basically smooth jazz guys get together and play some of the worst pop hits you've ever heard, and they do it in a radio-friendly way. They don't stretch out on them at all. So all of these songs are like 4 minutes long, maybe 5 minutes. They do Groovin' by the Rascals, that late 60s tune, which, if you want to hear it, you listen to the Rascals version. I'll Be There, a Jackson 5 song. Walk On By, that Dionne Warwick song. Dock of the Bay. Everyday People, the Sly and the Family Stone hit from the Stand By Me. Dancing in the Street. Pretty much terrible songs, to be honest with you. And you can see why this died a very quick death. I had a feeling it was going to be awful, and I was right. But I bought it because I don't know why I'm so fascinated with George Jinda. Now, George Jinda, on the Special Efx albums, if I didn't make this clear, plays only hand percussion. And I don't know if this is true, that one of his favorite musicians was actually Jack DeJohnette, a drummer. Now, on the Special Efx albums, there's a lot of tracks where they bring in outside drummers, kit drummers. For some reason, George Jinda never played kit on albums. I don't know why. I just found out a few years ago, after he died, that George Jinda started off playing drum kit and actually recorded some solo albums when he was in Hungary. And there's one up on YouTube, which was almost like a fusion thing, apparently with George Jinda playing drums. Now, for some reason, he gave up the drums and went to hand percussion. But the weird thing is, it's kind of interesting to me that even in the studio albums, when you can do overdubbing, once he got Special Efx together, he never played any drum kit on the albums. You think he could have. He obviously had the technique, because not only did he start playing drum kit, he actually recorded solo albums, apparently, at least one that I know of, in Hungary, as a kit drummer. But yet never, ever touched kit. And, would bring in drummers as guests on his own albums, on Special Efx albums. So I don't know. I would have, if I had known that, I would have asked him, because I got to talk to him once. So here's their next album, done after that awful, this one to skip. If you ever can find or hear that, it's just awful. You almost want to hear it because it's so awful, like a bad B movie. Special Efx double feature was the next album. I think that's album number 5 for them. This is really good. Not up there with Mystique. Almost a progressive rock vibe in some of the tracks. Not as mellow and laid back and new agey as Mystique, which is where I would start with them. At least for the people that watch my videos, because I think they're more in tune to. I don't really know anybody that watches my videos that's a real heavily into smooth jazz. So this video is just for those guys that maybe want to jump in a little bit to Special Efx and have no idea which ones to get. I'll tell you which ones not to get. This is pretty good. I'd start off with Mystique, if you're a new age or synthesizer fan at all. This one is good. There's almost a progressive rock vibe to it. Still some really nice tunes. In addition to Chieli Minucci and George Jinda, Omar Hakim plays drums. Dave Weckl plays drums. Sashi, actually, George Jinda's writing partner, the keyboard player, actually does play on this one. Robbie Condor and Michael Bearden, who are 2 early contributors on keyboards to their sound, were still around here. Oops, I just dropped the disc. And Mark Egan again plays bass. I think this might have been the last time Mark Egan played with them. But I went through a period of getting anything and everything by either one of them. And I bought this one, the Big Bang Global Percussion Masters. You could see Jack DeJohnette, Carl Palmer plays on here. Glenn Velez, Mickey Hart, Jack DeJohnette. Did I say Jack DeJohnette? There's a very interesting track, a dual percussion track. Mino Senelu, who people probably would know because he played as a percussionist with Weather Report and Joe's Out on those bands, and George Jinda together doing a percussion duet. It's only maybe 4 or 5 minutes. And apparently the 2 of them went out and played gigs as a percussion duo, but I can't find any more information other than that. And they do 1 4-minute piece on here, just the 2 of them, Mino Senelu and George Jinda, and it's really interesting. And I paid like $15 to get that one track because I'm such a George Jinda fanatic. George Jinda was an interesting percussionist because, like I said, he stayed away from kit even though he could play it. But the interesting thing is, most hand percussionists heavily play congas, and I don't know of any albums where he actually played any congas. He was very much into talking drums, udu drums, which are, especially for a more commercial, jazzy sound, not avant-garde music, are kind of interesting instruments. He used all kinds of shakers and bells and things like that. But the udu drums and the talking drums are really two of his favorite things, and he did extensive overdubbing with them and came up with some interesting, unusual percussion styles. I wouldn't say sounds, but style. My first album I ever bought by them. And I actually had it sitting on the shelf for a while before I bought anything else. Confidential, which I think is album number 6 or 7. This is not a bad album, but they did something on here which they would do on future albums, which kind of hurt the flow of the album. They put a vocal tune on there. That's some guy singing, "Hey, let's go downtown, let's go downtown." It stinks. But there's another 8 songs on here that are instrumental. This is a pretty good one too, because it's the most fusion, kind of aggressive fusion that they ever did. And not that there's 2 really pretty quiet pieces on here, which are unlike anything else they ever recorded too. But it's also, there's a little more of aggression on here than there were on any of their other albums, and I really like it. After that, they settled into make a couple albums, just like Magic. What the hell is this? 1990, I think, at this point. 1990. I remember. Strictly from memory, I did that. Short songs, 4 or 5 minute tunes. There's a sameness to the tunes, a little bit more mellow, laid back. To me, the worthwhile thing is they're still doing the duets, the percussion guitar duets, which I like. Piece of the World, the next album, which is another one, very mellow, a little bit more oriented toward acoustic guitar. There's a sameness to the tracks, and there's no kind of experimenting so much anymore. The songs are pretty straightforward, 5-minute tracks, laid back, not bad. But they meld into the background. For me, it's almost impossible, those last 2 albums, to really almost actively pay attention to them. Still, they had the percussion duet, the percussion guitar duet, which I love so much. Here's one to pick up, though. After those 2 albums, they just did a complete 180. And this is the only album where they did this. You know how I mentioned every album they have one track where they do that's just guitar and percussion, just George Jinda and Chieli Minucci. On this album, they were really feeling it, I guess. They were really inspired by each other. There's no less than 3 tracks on here, 3, which is more than they ever did. Out of the 10 tracks, are extensively just George and Chieli Minucci together. Chieli Minucci also playing some keyboards to support it. But it's not just, most of the albums, those tracks that they do are improvised. These, maybe one of them is improvised, 2 of them seem to be written out. But there's some nice themes in here. Kenny Werner plays on here. There's, I think this is the first album that actually even had a guest saxophone player, and the guitar isn't always the lead voice. Bob Mintzer plays sax on here on a couple tunes, which is, a nice, really nice, actually, change for their music. And the particular thing with those 3 tracks that Chieli Minucci and George do together, there's a lot, probably more than any of their other group albums that I can think of. George overdubs a lot of percussion, and that's my thing. That's really what I want to hear him do. There's, those tracks, especially 2 of the 3 tracks that are just duets. There's a lot of percussion going on, a lot of layers, hand percussion. Really, really, really nice, and very well recorded. Kenny Werner, Bob Mintzer, I think I mentioned. Mark Ledford, who was one of the vocalists for a brief time with Pat Metheny, plays on here. I think he passed away. I actually saw him play. Mark Ledford came on and did some vocal improvisations during an encore of one of the Special Efx concerts I saw in '95, I think it was. Gerald Beasley, the bass player, Lionel Cordew, the drummer, who played as the live drummer for Special Efx for many, many years. So this is a good one. This is another one I'd recommend picking up. If you see this one, and I used to see a lot of used copies of this one around. Still, it's marred by one vocal song, but it's a 55-minute album with a 4-minute vocal song. A collection, nothing rare, nothing new. This is a GRP thing that they put together. I wouldn't say it's their, couple great, there's a few really great songs on here, but far from what I would compile the best of. But This is another one that might be out there that you can get cheaply, and a good sampler. Now, the meat and potatoes of this. George Jinda and Chieli Minucci both started to do solo projects while Special Efx was still going on. And they were busy. This is 92. This is my favorite thing that George ever did. He formed a group called World News. It was a 4-piece band, and the membership stayed intact for the 2 albums they did. And this time, his writing partner, the pianist Sashi, is actually in the band. Very few guest appearances on these. The core band is George Jinda on percussion, Gerald Beasley on electric bass, Sashi on acoustic grand piano only, and a guy I discovered through these albums I became a huge fan of, Randy Roos, R-O-O-S, a guitarist who plays guitar and guitar synthesizers. And when you hear these albums, you're sure that there's keyboard synthesizers, but Sashi is only playing acoustic piano. And Randy Roos does a lot of overdubbing, apparently, and there's a lot of electronic textures coming from his guitars. Fantastic player, fantastic writer. I mentioned how the Special Efx albums are split 50-50 between Chieli Minucci's writing and George Jinda and Sashi's writing. And in George Jinda's group, the writing is split 50-50 between George Jinda and Sashi's pieces and Randy Roos's pieces. And they're all great. And this is weird because Randy Roos, after the band split up, said, it was kind of a smooth jazz group. I have to differ. The 2 albums they recorded, these tracks, there's not a melody that sticks with you. It's very complex. The bass of the tune, you can hear it's very well recorded. I wouldn't say commercial sounding. Far less commercial sounding than Special Efx, actually. A lot of percussion colors. On each of the 2 albums that George Jinda and World News made, there's only a couple guest appearances by a kit drummer. So there's a lot, 90% of the percussion on the tunes is coming all from George Jinda's hand percussion. So you really get to hear him play. Extensive overdubbing. It's my go-to thing when I want to hear George play, even more so than the Special Efx discs. These 4 musicians played incredibly together. One track on one album has a guest saxophone player soloing, and Special Efx's drummer plays on 1 or 2 tracks on each of the albums. But apart from that, all the percussion is George Jinda. Fantastic. Guys, if you find these, use copies of these around us. Unfortunately, both of their albums are on the JVC label. JVC was a very, very, very short-lived record label from the Stereo Company. They got into records and got out very quickly, making sure that all the records recorded at the JVC are long out of print. If you can find used copies, do so. Randy Roos is an incredible guitarist based out of Boston. Sashi is a fine keyboard player. And George, I love George anyway, so... those are my favorite things. As a matter of fact, playing in the background is the 2nd album of George Jinda's World News. I was going to play Special Efx, but I love World News so much. And you get to hear more George there. So the next Special Efx album came along in 1993. Oh, this is 93. Was this for JVC? Yeah, they were signed to JVC for a while, so called Play. This went out of print. This is a pretty decent album. Actually, this is the last. Yeah, this is the last album that I would say pick this up if you can get it cheaply, because they made a decisive change in musical direction after Play, and went for a funkier commercial sound, and all their albums started sounding the same after this, pretty much. But I'm doing these in the order they were recorded, actually, for the most part. So in 93 also, George recorded his 2nd solo album. This is the one that's been playing, his 2nd album with World News, I should say, not his 2nd solo album. Because apparently he did solo albums in Hungary. And this is what's been playing. And again, Randy Roos on guitars, Sashi on acoustic piano, Gerald Beasley on bass. Couple guest appearances by Lionel Cordew, who's Special Efx drummer. And this I took with me right after I bought this. Shortly after I bought this, I took this with me to a Special Efx concert and got George to sign it. And I'm glad I did. Less than a year later, George, who always suffered very badly from asthma, had a severe asthma attack, prevented oxygen from getting to his brain. Basically, the result of that was similar to a stroke, and that he spent the rest of his life after that. It's about a year or two after I got him to sign that, and after that album came out. So as a result of that severe asthma attack, which he always suffered from asthma apparently, it affected, he didn't get oxygen to the brain, and he was paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life in hospice care for about 5, 6, 7 years or something like that until he passed away. It's very sad. Imagine that, not being able to move, but being awake and alert. But before that, the Fantasy Band. I bought this. Why? Because George Jinda played on it. They show a riverboat. Apparently there was they never said who, there was a band scheduled to play on this riverboat jazz cruise. And something happened and the band backed out. I don't know who it was or why because they didn't mention it. And a bunch of New York musicians got together and quickly formed this group and put together some repertoire to play this concert. Lionel Cordew, who was Special Efx drummer, George Jinda on percussion, a guy named John Lee on bass, Chuck Loeb on guitars. Now, Chuck Loeb has his own career as a smooth jazz guitarist and latest guitarist in Foreplay, Bob James Group, David Mann and Marion Meadows on soprano saxes and alto and tenor sax, Dave Samuels on vibraphone, hell of a band, and Christopher Spendell on keyboards. I don't know what band backed out of the gig, but this was a pretty interesting band. The album is a little bland. It's a little bland, very much in the smooth jazz frame. And this is from '93 also. I don't know if, besides that live gig, they actually toured much. I don't see how George is already involved in Special Efx and World News both. Right at the time that I saw them, George Jinda told me that he wanted to take Special Efx in a more funky vein, and what he probably really meant was commercial. And from this point on, I would say don't even bother. Yeah, this is '95, I think, when they made their '94. Big change, very funk-oriented. The first album, this one is not that bad because it was something new to them and they kind of were getting things out of their system that they hadn't done before. But they also do Mercy, Mercy Me, Marvin Gaye song with a vocalist. But this was a big change to the more commercial. And they stayed in that groove, pretty much for all their future recordings. They actually only made one more together with George Jinda called This Is Body Language. Very much like Catwalk, like the one I just showed you. Very much a funky, commercial, smooth jazz. Doesn't even sound like the same band that made the prior albums, actually, to me. This one is '95. And at this point, apparently, I don't know, apparently Chieli Minucci and George Jinda were not getting along that well. Chieli Minucci is a very easygoing guy from everything I've seen, and I've actually had a couple of emails back and forth with him briefly years ago. Seems like a very nice guy. George, I think, was a little more intense and probably a little more difficult to get along with. And apparently during the recording of this album, they were still splitting the writing equally, 50-50. And Chieli Minucci would go in, I don't know, it was like during the day, and record his pieces with a bunch of musicians. And later on, George would overdub percussion parts. And then in the evenings, or vice versa, whatever, George would go in with his bunch of musicians and record his pieces, and then Chieli Minucci would overdub guitar parts on there. So they weren't really spending much time together at this point. And right after this, they split, oddly enough. And Chieli Minucci didn't even put up a fight. He allowed George Jinda to use the name Special Efx and have the name, which kind of shows you, to me, the kind of guy Chieli Minucci was. He allowed George, you can have the name, you can call your, essentially it was a solo project at that point. You can have the name. And, for a lot of people have no idea who's in the band. So a band name is a pretty big deal. Sadly, though, which one came first? Well, before George made a Special Effects album without Chieli Minucci, he recorded his third and last American solo album. And unfortunately, he ditched World News, which was sad because World News is still to this day my favorite thing he ever did. As much as I love early Special Effects, I love those two World News albums. And he ditched World News and recorded this album, Between Dreams. Very commercial, very much like those Special Effects, the last two Special Effects albums. Very, very funk oriented. And sadly, there's two cover tunes on here. One of them is, damn it, it's covered up. Just My Imagination by the Temptations. Kind of shows you the direction he was going in. So he did an instrumental version of Just My Imagination by the Temptations, that track. And guess what? That's the only thing that they played on the radio is that track. So he's got like 7 other tracks that are originals that are probably better than Just My Imagination. Certainly tracks I like better. Not up to World News standards. And where do they play Just My Imagination on the radio? At least the one smooth jazz station that New York had. That's what they chose to play. I was disgusted by that. Not an album to bother picking up, I would say. And then George made what was actually to be his last. Since Chieli Minucci allowed him to use the name Special Effects and have it, this is really a George Jinda solo album. The ironic title, Here to Stay. The only album made without guitarist Chieli Minucci. And it was George Jinda and a guy that he found that started playing in Special Effects during their last funk period. The last 2 prior albums that I showed, they found this guitarist, or George did, named Mark Johnson. And Mark Johnson plays kind of like very commercial R&B, smooth jazz saxophone. And they brought him into Special Effects. And when Chieli Minucci allowed George to have the name, really Mark Johnson ended up being the main lead voice in the band at that point. Even though all of the songs on this album were written by George Jinda and Sashi, still Sashi's his musical partner, and yet oddly enough, Sashi doesn't play on the album at all. George Jinda put together the whole album, the whole band, and had a lot of guests. A lot of the percussion, sadly enough, are drums that are programmed through the keyboard or played through the keyboard samples, and there's not as much, oddly enough, George Jinda percussion on here. And it seems like most of the pre-programmed stuff is played by Mark Johnson, the saxophone player who doubles on keyboards. Bunch of guitarists on here to kind of take Chieli Minucci's place and to make sure that Special Effects, because obviously the guitar in Special Effects music was a big presence, still is on this album, but he's brought in a whole bunch of different guitarists to fill that void. A guy named Ben Butler, Mark Whitfield, who had his own albums out, and Chuck Loeb as the guitarists. I listened to this one a lot, but I listened to it because it was George's last one, because that's when shortly after George went on a tour supporting this album, a short tour, just a few weeks, I think. And sometime after that tour was when he had that asthma attack, and that was it. That was over. That was the end. But go to show you how much of a Special Effects nut I became. I bought anything and everything associated with it. Anything. There was a time that this guy, Ed Hamilton, I bought this only because he was named as the new guitarist of Special Effects. I don't know that he ever got to play with it. He wasn't, seriously enough, he doesn't play on this album. The one George Jinda Special Effects album, he doesn't play on here. So I think he may be a guitarist that George Jinda found after this album, after Here to Stay was recorded. And I think he may have toured during that brief few weeks that George toured as Special Effects without Chieli Minucci. I'm not even sure. There's no other proof that I can find of Ed Hamilton playing in Special Effects during George Jinda's short period of running the band. I'm not even halfway through. This is really sad. Just to show you, I bought anything and everything George Jinda, Chieli Minucci associated. Here's Sashi. a couple people out there, if you were around when GRP was big in the late 80s, Sashi, the Hungarian pianist who was George Jinda's musical writing partner, I don't know if he ever moved to the U.S. I'm not sure. He may have stayed in Hungary all the time or been in the U.S. and gone back. Had a couple albums. I remember seeing like big new age albums. One of these albums is all pretty much acoustic piano with George Jinda playing some percussion on it, which is why I bought it. And this album, or maybe the other way around, also I remember seeing this was a pretty big album, I think, for a short time. Again, pretty much all acoustic piano solos. I think George plays on 2 tracks on this and percussion, and that's it. But these are really good albums. These are albums I could still listen to today, regardless of the George Jinda content or not. But I'm such a George Jinda fan, and Chieli Minucci as well. Here's a Hungarian pianist, Laszlo Gardane, who I'd never heard of, that I bought this album only because George Jinda plays on it. Interesting thing, though, when I got the album, and I'm trying to get the, I always have trouble getting the booklets out when I'm recording a video. On this album, Laszlo Gardane plays only acoustic piano, George Jinda on percussion. There's a Japanese second percussionist, a Japanese guy who plays electric bass, and interestingly enough, Mick Goodrick, the American jazz guitarist, plays guitar on here. Now, Laszlo Gardane, which is a Hungarian guy, which I had never heard of, actually formed a trio at one point with Miroslav Vidas. Now, that's somebody that I know very well. And it's weird because I never, through all my Miroslav Vidas albums and associations, I never picked up. This is an interesting album, not particularly well recorded, so the percussion doesn't sound that great. But it's interesting. It's both of the, no drummer, 2 hand percussionists, electric bass and piano, and Mick Goodrick on guitar. Could have been recorded better, but it's an interesting album. Pretty obscure. Avenue Jazz. I think it was a Los Angeles-based record label. It wasn't even an import. Here's one for electronic music. I can't believe George did this. I don't know anything about this band. I saw George was listed as playing cymbals and bells. Here's an album called Spacious. It's like a 36-minute album. It's 2 electronic keyboard players and George Jinda playing select cymbals and bells. The only thing like this, and I wasn't even sure, is this really the same George Jinda? But I guess so. There's 2 guys, Johnny Spacious, so these are fake names, and Fritz Spacious, listed as playing analogs. So I guess they mean analog synthesizers. This is a really, really obscure album out of a label out of Miami, Florida. So it's these 2 musicians playing analog synthesizers and George Jinda making sounds on cymbals and bells. Very weird, but very good album. Very short. Definitely of interest to synth fans. As a matter of fact, the first track is called Tribute to Tangerine Dream. I don't know how I ever found out about this album. From 1993. This would be one that probably a lot of people would like that watch my videos. I think I bought this on Amazon, but this is more than 10 years ago. Of course, nowadays you got eBay and Discogs. You could probably find a little bit more information about this album. Really nice though. And I'm so much into these guys for years. I even bought Mark Johnson solo albums because George Jinda played on them. I actually have 3 of them. I only have 2 here. I don't even have all of them here. I don't even have everything I have by these guys here. Mark Johnson was a saxophone player, the R&B style saxophone player that joined Special Efx when George Jinda decided to make them a more funky commercial band around 1995, 94, 95, which I wasn't a fan of. And yet I bought his solo albums, also on JVC and had a friend, simply because George and Chieli Minucci plays on a couple tracks on his albums as well. But George plays percussion throughout, and George co-produced the albums. And I bought them. It could be like a David Sanborn album, which is not something I'm into. But I'm so much into these guys, I bought anything they played on. Christoph Spendel, particularly nice keyboard player. I think he's in New York, but he's from Germany, I think. Um, all of the associated musicians that played the Special Effects are on here. Omar Hakim, Lionel Cordew, who was their live drummer, Gerald Beasley, who played bass with Special Effects and with George Jinda's World News. Mark Johnson plays on this. Oscar Castro Neves, as a matter of fact, Bob Mincer, and George Jinda plays on this. So I bought it because George Jinda plays on it. Oh my God! You should see the stack I got. This stack is going to come crashing down, so I'm gonna move it before something happens. Let it crash down over there. Damn it! I knew that was gonna happen. Cave in. All right, hold on, guys. So, I was going on how I bought anything and anything these guys played. The bass player, Gerald Beasley, who played both with Special Effects, electric bass, and George Jinda's World News. I bought some of his solo albums. I actually have 3 or 4 of his solo albums, simply because, well, on one of them, George Jinda and Chieli Minucci play, and on another one, just Chieli Minucci on this one, which I think this was recorded after George was hospitalized, actually. But I love those guys so much. I picked up anything and everything they did, which includes Odd Terms. You may, if you were around JRP music in the, in the 80s, Deborah Henson Conant, the harp player, made some smooth jazz albums for GRP. Guess who was her musical partners on them? Chieli Minucci and George Jinda, as well as some of the early keyboard players that played in the early. It's essentially Special Effects, almost entire backup band that played on these albums with her in a smooth jazz kind of way with harp. And if you were around and were into this kind of music then, you probably would have seen these, as I did, in the shops, and I had no idea initially until they were long out of print that Chieli Minucci or George Jinda was even involved. I even bought this one because I had one track of her, The Art of Harp, of Deborah Henson Conant playing with George Jinda and Chieli Minucci on, just for one song. I bought this. That goes to show you how just I would go nuts for anything these guys did. So, Chieli Minucci, because George Jinda started making solo albums, he encouraged Chieli Minucci to do some as well. His first album, Jules, which is actually another one on JVC, which was really good, from 95. And George Jinda actually plays on a bunch of tracks. This is really good because at this time, Special Effects had gone real funky, and Chieli Minucci wanted to kind of break out and explore other things. And he even does, his father was a composer, and he even does this like semi-symphonic piece for like guitar and orchestra that his dad wrote on this album. A couple of vocal tracks I could do without, but a lot of really good tracks on here. I went nuts years later because I found out that my CDs are falling again. I got like 20 CDs in my lap here. I like this album so much that when I found out years later in Japan they had a bonus track that was issued only in Japan, I spent some ridiculous money to get the JVC Japanese version with the bonus track, which is really hard to come by because, as I mentioned, JVC doesn't even make records anymore. The second solo album, not as good. Very mellow, very laid back, blends into the background. Acoustic guitar oriented. Most of the tracks more acoustic guitar oriented. You know, the lead melodies are played on acoustic guitar. Pretty album, not formula bound like the kind of funk that the Special Effects band had become. So it's a nice album. But Jules is the one to get of his. And he continued making albums. This one was okay, pretty good. This is his third solo album. I think at this point he had given up. He had given up Special Effects. George was sick in the hospital, unable to play. So George basically said, "Take the name back," you know. So what happened is now, you know, what was once a band with the two of them, and then was a band of just George Jinda's. Now Special Effects is Chieli Minucci solo band, basically. So I don't even know if these are in order anymore. Chieli Minucci actually had signed two record deals. He had signed a deal as a solo artist and started making solo albums during the time that George Jinda had the Special Efx name. And then when he got the Special Efx name back, Chieli Minucci, which was Special Efx is now Chieli Minucci solo band, signed another contract to make records with Special Efx. In reality, there's no difference between Special Efx and Chieli Minucci solo albums. There's no constant, really, band members in Special Efx. It's whoever's around. He may use the same drummer for years and years and years, but they're not so much a member. They can have an album without them. So what happened was, one year you would get a Chieli Minucci solo album. The next album would be no different music in terms of musical direction. Next album would be Special Efx featuring Chieli Minucci. The next album would be Chieli Minucci solo album, and then the next album would be Special Efx featuring Chieli Minucci. But musically, there's absolutely no difference. So after a few years of doing that back and forth, I think Chieli Minucci stopped. I don't think he does solo albums so much by name anymore. I think most of them just come out as Special Efx. Like this, like Chieli Minucci and Special Efx, but he really is the only guy. Is this the one? I don't remember. I ordered this right off of his site because it came with a bonus CD. I actually got his signature as well as George's now. See, Gary. I forgot about this totally until I opened this tonight. Yeah, this was like a special edition that came with a bonus disc if you ordered it through his website. Sweet guy, nice guy, talented guy. I'm not crazy about the music that he makes now. Travels, this is an interesting thing. This is something he recorded not to be released. It was a download-only album, and it was much more experimental and not a smooth jazz album. This is good if you can find it. I know it was available initially as a download, only briefly on Watchfire Music did it come out. What years? 2008. This is probably still out there in one form or another. This is very interesting album. Not geared toward radio play. There's a 17-minute track on here. Yeah, one of the tracks is 17 minutes, another 9 minutes and 45 seconds. Not at all like the Special Efx, even the early Special Efx music. I bought this twice. I bought this as downloaded. This was probably, of all the things since '95, probably amongst my favorite, because once they became a more funk-oriented band, whether it was led by George Jinda or Chieli Minucci, the record started sounding the same to me, and started sounding like anything on a smooth jazz radio station. I'm gonna try to go. I'm trying to get through these. East of the Sun was another little project, just like the last one I showed. Very good if you can get it. Another thing on Watchfire Music, not meant for radio play, and as a result, it doesn't have that funky commercial thing going on. And probably also the two albums, the previous one I showed and this one, are definitely my favorite thing. Favorite two things he's done since 1995. Asian Sunrise. This is mellower stuff. The Meditator, East of the Sun, Tranquility, Night of the Crickets. A lot more different and creative, but also obscure and kind of hard to get. Did this also come out in 2008? Yeah, these two albums came out in 2008 or 2009. They've been recorded, I think, a couple years before, available as downloads. These are good if you can find them and get them at a reasonable price. Smooth Jazz plays Duke Ellington. I bought this because Chieli Minucci plays on one track, I think it's Sophisticated Lady. He plays a funky version of Sophisticated Lady. I only bought it for that reason. I'm a completist, I guess. I really can't listen to Christmas albums, so it's amazing that I buy them. But Chieli Minucci wrote two new songs, supposedly with kind of like a Christmas holiday feel. One called Magic, one called Joyous, but not a cover of a traditional Christmas song. For this, these are good tunes. A compilation, Spyro Gyra plays on this. It goes to show you Earl Clue, Hiroshima, all new tunes. This is from '99. This is Wind of Hill. They had already, well, they're gone. I think a lot of these albums are nearly impossible to get. Here's an example of the Special Effects that's really Chieli Minucci solo band masterpiece. One of the better ones post. This could be the best post 1995 album made under the name Special Effects, because it's not just funk stuff. There's a couple almost fusiony things on here, but those two prior Chieli Minucci solo albums that I showed from 2008, 2009, I would pick those up first. More commercial. This is during the years that Chieli Minucci is alternating between making one album one year under his name, making another album under the Special Effects name, but musically not real different. They're both very, very commercial, very R&B based, funky stuff. So then the next year, since that one was a Chieli Minucci, this one was a Special Effects album. Two albums sounded identical to me. Night Grooves, another thing. We're getting to the point that I can't tell any of these albums apart, apart from the Masterpiece one that I showed a few albums ago. Very commercial. This one, R&B, instrumental R&B. This one under Chieli Minucci's name. The next one called Party, with a name like that, you know you're not going to get anything too deep, done under the Special Effects name. This is when I kind of almost started tuning out. I was still buying the albums, but after like a week or two, I wouldn't even listen to the new albums. I'd give them a few spins and onto the pile they would go. Got it going on. The last one was the Special Effects album, so this is a Chieli Minucci album, but no difference. All the musicians are the same, the music's the same. Sweet Surrender, Chieli Minucci and Special Effects. I don't even remember. I can't even tell you much about those. I bought, like I said, I bought anything and everything he played on. I think he plays on a couple tracks here. Hip hop, smooth, urban jazz. I don't think I listened to this after the first week I bought it. He did a collaboration. This is how crazy I was to just pick up anything Chieli Minucci, George Jinda related. Here's a singer, songwriter, pleasant enough voice, but not the kind of music I listen to. But Chieli Minucci wrote a bunch of tunes with her, so I bought it. Not bad, not bad. Not the kind of thing I really listen to much. But and my CD stopped playing, and this always happens. I put a second CD on there, and instead of the second CD playing, the whole disc ejects itself. The whole player. Hold on. Well, you know what? Maybe I'll just do the rest of that music. When I mentioned one of my favorite things that George Jinda did was the World News Band, and this is how one artist or one band leads into another. The guitarist and the guy that wrote 50% of the material for World News is this guy Randy Roos, just a fantastic original voice. And he's got at least 3 solo albums that I know of out. This one was actually recorded for Narada Equinox and doesn't sound like the other things on. Narada Equinox was, I think that was more their electronic label of Narada, and yet there's a lot of acoustic stuff on here. This is beautiful. This is very much like George Jinda's World News, almost like a third album they never made. Randy Roos plays electric, and he plays a lot of guitar synthesizers. There's a lot of keyboardy sounding backgrounds that are coming from the guitar. But the lead voice on the guitar sounds like an acoustic guitar, and I don't know if he's playing the melody on an acoustic guitar or whether he's playing an acoustic guitar sample on his electric guitar through a synthesizer, if that makes any sense. But this is fantastic. And you can dig up a used copy of this, man. This is wonderful. This is cinematic music. It's not real guitar-oriented. The guitar's lead voice, but the themes could be interpreted by an orchestra. There's some amazing, beautiful stuff. And Randy really put together a great band on here. He's got bass players, acoustic pianist, saxophonist, drummer, but he's got 3 horn players on here, and these are the things that add this orchestral texture to it, in addition to the synthesizers that Randy plays through the guitar. He's got an oboe player, a French horn player, and somebody who plays bamboo flute and penny whistle. And those are the things that give this album this really nice, unique, cinematic texture. Sounds a lot like really good music from a movie at times. Really beautiful. I think this is probably the best thing he ever did that I've heard. He followed that up a couple years later with a more techno. When I say early techno, here's an album that's almost entirely like synthesizer and electronic oriented, and I wouldn't say funky, a little bit more techno, but this is before techno really came out. This was on Narada Mystique, oddly enough, another, and from 1995. So it was a lot. This was before techno was really around. This is a very interesting album, fun. Doesn't have the cinematic quality of the last one I showed you. It's like Randy wants to do something different every album he makes. So this is a little bit more electronic oriented. He plays voice samples through the guitar on this one, a little more beat oriented maybe, but still really well done. I tried to follow him. He makes it hard to follow his career, actually. And he recorded, and I became such a fan, just like George Jinda and Chieli Minucci, that I started buying any album that had tracks by him on it that weren't on albums. So he recorded this Passion Music for Guitar for Narada Lotus label, and he does, I think there's two tracks on here, which are unique to this album, which he recorded for this album. Also, Ralph Ellenberger does 2 tracks on here, and David Arkenstone also does a track on here. And this is from 1994, and very nice album, pretty mellow. And I think all of the artists' tracks are unique to this album, if I'm not mistaken. I know Randy's are. Here's a Narada Artist Collection. Not a lot of names on here, actually. Eric Finstad and Michael Gettle and Nancy Rumble are the only other people on here. And Randy does a track on here, which is either unique to this album, I think. This is a pretty album too. Eric Finstad and Michael Gettle, but there's a whole bunch of other musicians on here that I've never even heard of. Nice album though. I gotta look. I haven't checked for Randy Roos albums for a while. He made it difficult to follow him. Instead of coming out with an album under his own name, he kind of came up with this Raz, R-A-Z, which is like a band concept. And it's been so long since I heard it, it's probably worth listening to again. I'm sure it is. But I don't have a memory of it. So it's not as innovative as I think. This is just a fantastic, pretty, beautiful album, Liquid Smoke. And this I would also recommend, even though it's more of a techno thing. Those two I would get first. Randy was just incredible. Very impressive guy. I got a few others that just go to show how insane I was with picking up anything and everything by these guys. But I tell you though, the last half a dozen or so Chieli Minucci Special Efx albums I bought never got played after probably like the first month that I had them. And I think he's come out with several since that I haven't even picked up. Their music changed so much and really became a much more commercial thing. But those albums I showed, George Jinda, World News, Randy Roos, those early Special Efx albums like Global Village and Mystique and Slice of Life and Modern Manners and Confidential, Double Feature, highly recommended, and things I still listen to this day. And I did this basically for Carm. But anybody that might want to dip your toes in, hopefully you know what to avoid now. Or hey, if you like funky fusion, then go for anything from Catwalk on, from 1994 on for Special Efx. But I think most people would probably be more like along my tastes. So stick with the early Special Efx, stick with World News if you can find any World News, and Randy Roos, who's just I got to look him up to see what the hell he's been doing in recent years. And I didn't mean to do a marathon video. I didn't even know my computer could hold another hour-long video, but I wanted to show what a nut I was for the Special Efx music for years, and I think I've proven it. Okay, guys, I got to put all these CDs back, which is the biggest hassle of all. Sorry for going on so long. I will get back to my regular programming next time. Okay, take care, everybody.